In this lesson, you're going to learn about the more complex chords you're likely to come across as a bass player, and you're going to learn exactly how to deal with them. Hi, I'm Luke from becomeabassist.com, and if you want to know all about the different kinds of seventh chords and exactly what you can play over them, keep watching. Welcome to part 3 of this chord series. Now the things we'll be covering in this lesson are a little bit more advanced, so if you don't already know how to find the roots, thirds and fifths of your major, minor, augmented and diminished triads, then I'd consider going back to parts 1 and 2 of this series, otherwise some of this won't make total sense to you. But if you're ready for the next level of chord knowledge, strap in, this is going to be fun. Okay, so you know all about different kinds of triads, and you know there are 4 main ones, your major, minor, diminished and augmented. The next step is to go from 3-note chords to 4-note chords. Logical enough, right? And that's exactly what this lesson is about. And because we're getting a little bit more complex, I'll also be including some scale suggestions for each of these chords because sometimes you may need them. Now you may have already heard about 7th chords. You might hear someone say it's D minor 7 going to G7 and then C major 7. Just like we had the kind of root, third and fifths of a chord, we can also have the 7ths, and it's the 7th note of whatever scale fits with that chord. Now we have 4 triads we've been working with and 2 potential versions of the 7th, the major and the minor. So that means we have 8 different combinations we can make. So let's start with some of the more common ones. First, let's take a major triad and put a major 7th on top of it. Obviously, that 7th is going to come from the major scale. Now, if we're using the A major chord, we put the major 7th on top. This is what we get. This is called a major 7th chord. Makes sense, right? Major triad with a major 7th, major 7th chord. Now you can also play, this is the first way of playing it, but you can also play it like this. Let's see. Yeah, you could also try this. Or even across 4 strings. Not very practical, but you know, it's an option for you. For an example of this sound, check out Stevie Wonder's My Cherie Amour. Tons of major 7th chords in there. Now, as far as scales go for these chords, obviously the major scale is going to work really well a lot of the time. The other possible scale that might work depending on the context is the Lydian mode. Now, for example, if you're in the key of E and you come across an A major 7 chord, then the Lydian mode, A Lydian, would be perfect in that specific context. Now there are a ton of different ways to notate this kind of chord. You can have Maj 7, MA 7, you can have the little triangle as well, or triangle 7. Lots of different ways to write this chord, and I've put them all in my free chord cheat sheets pack for you. You'll get all the essential information about the chords, how they're made, the different shapes, and how to play them, how they're notated, plus a scale catalog that's going to tell you what scales work over different chords. It's all free, and to get it, just click the link in the description. It'll be super helpful for you. Right now though, let's move on to our next chord type. For the next one, we're going to have a major triad, but this time we'll play a minor 7th. Yeah? This gives us something called a dominant 7th chord. So this would be A dominant 7, but more just commonly called A7. Now this can trip people up because they hear about 7th chords and then they just call everything a 7th chord, whether it's a major 7 or a minor 7. And there's a lot of mix-up, especially between major 7th chords and dominant 7th chords, because they share that same major triad. Yeah? It's just that the major 7th chords have that major 7, obviously, and the dominant 7th chords which have that minor 7th. Just be aware that whenever you see a 7 or any other number just by itself, no other kind of anything else, then it's a dominant chord. Major triad with a minor 7th on top. You hear these kind of chords everywhere. Your stock standard 12-bar blues uses dominant chords all the way through. And there's one other common way of playing this chord, and it looks like this. Yeah, you'll find this in chord charts written as just the letter and then the 7 after it. Although sometimes you will see another number, like for example you might see A9 or A13. As long as it's just a number and nothing else, you're most likely dealing with a dominant chord. Occasionally you'll see it written as A Dom 7, but like I said, that's not super common. Scale-wise, your mixed Lydian mode is what's going to work a lot of the time for these chords. Of course, it all depends on the context, and there's plenty of other sounds you could potentially use over dominant chords, especially if you start adding altered extensions, which we're not going to get into right now. Okay, let's move on to our next combination, a minor chord with a major 7 on top. And Any idea what you call that kind of chord? A minor with a major 7? It's actually just called a minor major 7 chord. It looks and sounds like that. You could also, pardon me, major 7. You could also potentially play it like this. But I like the other version better because it's all in one position. For an example of this chord, check out the final chord of the James Bond theme. It's totally a classic minor major 7 sound. As far as scales go for these chords, again, it's pretty context dependent, but the melodic minor as well as the harmonic minor are relatively safe choices if you ever come across these kind of chords in the wild. They're usually written on a chord chart with any of the minor triad symbols mixed with any of the major 7 symbols. So you might see A minus with the triangle, or you might see a lowercase m and then maj 7. It's a very specific sound, so it's usually notated pretty specifically. So that was minor chord major 7. What about minor chord minor 7? That'll give us a minor 7th chord. Root, minor 3rd 5th, and minor 7th. This is our first way of playing it, but you can also do this. I like this as well because it keeps everything in position too. It's really nice. Now these chords are super common. They happen all over the place. Check out the Doobie Brothers Long Train Running for a good example of this chord in action. This chord is actually kind of tricky to kind of slap a scale on since it can be used in so many different places harmonically. Here are some options for you though. You could try your Aeolian, or your Dorian, or your Phrygian. Yeah, Aeolian is arguably the most common, followed by Dorian and then Phrygian. If you're not sure, try them all, see which one feels the most home and the most natural. This one's also pretty easy to write down on paper. It's any of the ways to write a minor triad, and then you just slap a 7 after them basically. So A minus 7, or A lowercase m7, or sometimes A min 7. All the same thing, all a minor 7 chord. Next, let's start dealing with our augmented triads. Now what happens if you put a major 7th on top of an augmented triad? You get a major 7 sharp 5 chord. It looks like this. Yeah? You can also play it like this though. Yeah? And to be honest, this is probably the least common chord that we'll be looking at today. I couldn't really think of any good examples of it in popular music, but it does show up a little bit in jazz. If you really wanted an option for a scale to play here, you could use the Lydian augmented scale, also called the Lydian sharp 5 scale. And if you know your melodic minor scale, you can just play the 3rd mode of that, and that will give you your Lydian augmented. Now all this is laid out in my chord cheat sheets pack, by the way. Next, we can put a minor 7th on top of an augmented chord. This will give us a dominant 7 sharp 5 chord. For example, this would be an A7 sharp 5. That's right, this one is a 7 chord, a dominant chord with a sharp 5. Now how is this possible? How can we make a dominant chord from an augmented triad when we've already said that the dominant chord uses a major triad? Well, it has the major 3rd, just like a regular dominant chord, and has a minor 7th, just like a regular dominant chord. The only difference between this chord and this chord and the regular dominant 7th chord is the 5th. Sharp 5, regular 5. Pretty cool, right? Well, I think so, but I'm also kind of a nerd with all this stuff. You could also play the same chord like this. Yeah, this is pretty cool as well, plus it's all in one position. Now the only example I can think of off the top of my head for this one is the first chord of the bridge of the jazz standard Stella by Starlight, if you know that one. It's a very specific sound. And as far as scales go for this one, you could try the whole tone scale, but again, this would very much depend on the context of the tune it's in. Next, let's build a diminished chord with some 7s. Now, a diminished chord with a major 7, we're going to skip over because it doesn't really happen unless it's a very kind of specific situation. So let's jump to the diminished triad with a minor 7. Now, when you put a minor 7 on top of a diminished triad, you get a minor 7 flat 5 chord, also known as a half diminished chord. And we'll talk about the half part soon. Right now, though, I want to show you what it looks and sounds like. Just like that, diminished triad, minor 7. You could also play it up here. Both will be keeping you in position over the whole chord. Super handy. Now these chords aren't quite as uncommon as you might think, but they usually kind of come as a package deal with a dominant chord that's a fourth above. A classic example of this is Eric Clapton's Change the World. In the chorus, in the line, I would be the sunlight in your universe, the start of that phrase is a half diminished chord that does exactly this. It goes to a dominant chord a fourth above. And as far as scales go, a pretty safe bet is the Locrian mode. Now as far as writing this chord out, sometimes you see it written out in full, like A minor 7, flat 5, or sometimes it's just this symbol up here, the degree sign with a line through it. Usually that's enough to kind of notate the half diminished chord, but sometimes it'll also include a 7 as well, just in case. Alright, so if that's a half diminished chord, does that mean there's such a thing as a fully diminished chord? That is a very good question, and you're absolutely right. If you have a half diminished chord and you lower the 7th by 1 fret, you end up with a diminished 7 chord or a fully diminished chord. It looks like this and sounds like this. Yeah? You can also try this way of playing it. Just like that. Every note is a minor third apart, and it creates this very kind of spooky, kind of unnerving sound. Now the scales for this one are usually, again, pretty context dependent, but a good starting point is the diminished scale. And if you don't know how to make that, just alternate whole steps and half steps. Just make sure you're starting with the root from a whole step, so you end up with this. Whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. Diminished scale right there. A lot of times the diminished triad and this fully diminished 7th chord, they can be kind of interchangeable, but not always. You'll find them less in popular music, but they're relatively common in jazz music. Now once again, if you want all the core lessons from this video, plus all the shapes and diagrams for all the chords and scales we talked about in this entire series, be sure to download the Chords cheat sheet pack. You can use it as the ultimate reference, almost like an encyclopedia of chords. If you come across a chord and you're not sure how to deal with it, not sure how it works, the Chords cheat sheet pack will be able to help you figure out exactly how it's made and what you can play over it. It's totally free, so just click the link underneath this video, request it on that page, and I'll get it sent to you 100% free. To recap though, you learned all about the more complex 4-note chords. You learned that over each of the 4 chord triads, we can put either a major or minor 7th and get all kinds of different sounds. The one exception being the diminished 7th chord, where we lowered a minor 7th to create our fully diminished chord. Thank you so much for watching. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Make sure you head to the site and download the Chords cheat sheet pack so you'll never be stumped over what to play over a chord. I'm Luke McIntosh from becomeabassist.com, and hopefully I'll catch you in another video soon.